This First Friday lecture is supported by the class gift given by the 2023 graduates of the basic program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Simon at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Simon and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Simon's video will be spotlighted during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select Speaker View instead of Gallery View. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. You can find links to more information in the chat box. The Basic Program is a 4-year non-credit certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original thinkers in their original texts. Through focused discussion and close reading, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western traditions in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago trained instructors. Registration is now open for summer quarter and autumn quarter courses. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on June 7, when our speaker will be Noah Shafetz. Noah's title will be Funeral Games in the Iliad. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Simon Friedland joined the Basic Program instructional staff in 2023. He received his PhD in 2021 from the University of Chicago in German Studies with a dissertation entitled The Pulse of Prosody, Versification and Antiquity in the Age of Weimar Classicism. From 2021 to 2023, Simon remained at the university as a humanities teaching fellow. Simon is a graduate of Reed College. While a student, Simon spent 1 year in Berlin at the Freie Universität. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Kendall. Let me share my screen here and get up my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that and hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, I'll get started. Few monuments are as intimately associated with Berlin and with Germany more generally than the Brandenburg Gate. Recalling both the Roman triumphal arch and the Doric columns of the Propylaea, the entranceway to the Acropolis of Athens, the Brandenburg Gate is one of the most famous instances of neoclassical architecture in Europe. Those of you who have visited Berlin have likely walked through the gate and down the major boulevard, Unter den Linden, passing by many other instances of neoclassical architecture, including the Neue Wache, originally a guardhouse and now a war memorial, the Schauspielhaus, the Schlossbrücke, or Castle Bridge with its statues of Greek gods, leading over to the famous Museum Island, on which the visitor finds, among other landmarks, the Pergamon Museum, housing the Pergamon altar dating back to the 2nd century BC, and the Altus Museum, one of the first museums open to the public and arranged according to modern curatorial principles. This talk is not about neoclassical architecture in Berlin, but I want to start with this panorama to convey the extent to which some of the most famous and visible sites of modern Germany are oriented towards classical antiquity. In this talk, I will explore some of the intellectual impulses and currents behind this orientation, covering the period roughly between 1750 and 1830. It is during this time that the labor of cultural encounter between ancient and modern took place with unprecedented intensity in the German-speaking lands. Indeed, it is during this time that in Germany, the paradigms of ancient and modern achieved their concrete form. Lacking a unified nation state and striving against French cultural hegemony, German-speaking artists, philosophers, scholars, and poets turned outward and far into the past in an effort to come to know themselves, their place in the world, the possibilities of their language, and the pitfalls of their society. I will mention many major figures of German cultural life during the period in question, but I'll give little biographical information about them in this talk. My intention is, rather, to give biographies of ideas. This account is, in turn, autobiographical, in that these are some of the ideas that have inspired me and that I worked out in my dissertation. What I want to convey is the vitality and centrality of these ideas for an understanding of classical antiquity, of art, and of ourselves. While Berlin's imposing monuments can give the impression of stolid, stuffy ideals and inert grandiosity, the discourse animating the turn to antiquity, in particular Greek antiquity, at the end of the 18th century was anything but static. Indeed, in an important sense, the beginnings of this turn to classical antiquity could be said to lie not in an image of harmony, unity, and unblemished monumentality, but in a body in pain, the body of Laocoön, as displayed in this sculpture, now in the Vatican museums. The statue depicts the punishment of the Trojan priest Laocoön and his sons. There are different accounts of why he incurred the wrath of the gods. In Virgil's version, which may have an earlier source, it is because Laocoön insisted that the Trojan horse was a trap. Be that as it may, there's no single art object more important for German classicism. Indeed, I would say for German aesthetics as a whole in the later half of the 18th century. It is important in large part due to the debate about it set off by Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who makes this statue the set piece of his epoch-making treatise, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and the Art of Sculpture. The statue group, excavated in Rome in 1506, is thought by art historians today to date to the early imperial period of Rome, but Winckelmann took it to be authentically Greek. Indeed, Winckelmann turns to a discussion of the sculpture directly after his profoundly influential encapsulation of the greatest works of Greek art. What generally characterizes the excellence of Greek masterpieces is, finally, a noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, both in the pose and in the expression. Just as it always remains calm in the depths of the sea, however much it may rage on the surface, so the expression of Greek figures, whatever passions they may be subject to, reveal a great and placid soul. Edle Einfalt und stille Größe, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. In its laconic eloquence, this formula would come to define the prime qualities of ancient Greek art for a generation of Germans. But how or where exactly does Winckelmann find evidence for these qualities in the Laocoön statue? The answer is everywhere on the body, but most significantly in the face. This pain is expressed, Winckelmann writes, without any rage in the face and in the whole pose. He does not raise any terrible scream, as Virgil says in his verse of his Laocoön. The opening of his mouth will not allow it. It is more an anxious and oppressed sighing. The pain of the body and the greatness of the soul are distributed throughout the body of the figure with equal strength and balanced equally. Laocoön suffers, but he suffers like Sophocles' Philoctetes. His misery touches us to the very soul, but we wish that we, like that great man, could bear that misery. Why does Winckelmann insist that Laocoön doesn't scream, but merely sighs? What is at stake in this claim? How can we know for certain what sound a statue is making? The answer to these questions, I believe, is that for Winckelmann, Laocoön embodies an ethical existential ideal, an ideal that he takes to be quintessentially Greek. Were the Trojan priest to scream, this would mean that he was completely and uncontrollably given over to his suffering, reduced to animal status. But Winckelmann sees in the half-opened mouth and arched eyebrows the equipoise of suffering and strength. He is not at one with his pain, for he has it within himself to transcend his suffering by the dignity with which he suffers, not bent and broken, but stretching out his great rippling body in a display of straining strength. The human being can do this. This statue is, in my reading of Winckelmann, an embodiment of the human grandeur and dignity that reveals itself precisely in suffering. In the Winckelmannian anthropology that emerges from this key passage of the Imitation essay, the human being is not so much a rational being as zoon logon ekon, an animal possessing logos, reason, language, speech, but rather a nobly suffering being. I see in Winckelmann's account of the Laocoön grouping a tragic affirmation of human existence that would find its most eloquent German spokesman in Friedrich Nietzsche. The universe may obliterate the human being, but it is in the power of the human soul and the artist who represent it to say yes to existence in and as suffering. Under Winckelmann's pen, the Laocoön statue becomes almost a pagan alternative to the Passion of Christ. Ecce homo, behold the man. The most powerful and influential response to Winckelmann's understanding of the Laocoön sculpture group came from Gotthold Ephraim Lessing in his 1766 treatise Laocoön, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry. Recall Winckelmann's claim that Laocoön suffers, but he suffers like Sophocles' Philoctetes. Lessing's intervention is to maintain that the sculpted Laocoön does not suffer as the literary Laocoön suffers. I stress the distinction here between the medium of sculpture and literature because this will be all important for Lessing. The literary Philoctetes, who has acquired an excruciating and stinking foot wound from a snake bite, suffers, to take one example, in the following way. Ah, papa pai, papa, 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 papai, which means something like ow or ah or ouch. Yet the distinction Lessing makes between Laocoön's suffering and Philoctetes' suffering is not an ethical one. It is not that Philoctetes, in suffering in this way, is less noble than Laocoön. Lessing's distinction is one of medium, namely that between visual and verbal art. Lessing is concerned with the enabling conditions of artistic media. He writes, "It remains true that succession of time is the province of the poet, just as space is that of the painter. That time is the decisive factor in poetry while space is the decisive factor in painting may seem fairly straightforward, but it has far-reaching and complex consequences for Lessing. I will give a simplified version of those consequences here. Because the painter, and here the painter stands in for the visual artist in general, is bound by space, he must choose a single moment in time to depict, a moment that will stand there forever, unchanging. Laocoön, according to Lessing's reasoning, cannot be screaming because this would fix the figure in a permanent posture of wretchedness that would repulse the viewer and betray the laws of beauty. Lessing writes, simply imagine Laocoön's mouth forced wide open and then judge. Imagine him screaming and then look. From a form which inspired pity because it possessed beauty and pain at the same time, it has now become an ugly, repulsive figure from which we gladly turn away. For the sight of pain provokes distress. However, the distress should be transformed through beauty into the tender feeling of pity. The literary Philoctetes can scream because his scream passes in the temporal succession of the poem. The artist, by contrast, must choose a scene that encapsulates the entire unfolding of an action, a scene that grasps the whole of an action, in a sense, overcoming the artwork's boundedness in space to unfold in the viewer's imagination like poetry. It is this scene that Lessing calls the pregnant moment. As David Welberry writes, who is my beloved advisor and who wrote sort of the book on Lessing, by selecting the pregnant moment, the artist transcends the material limits of his semiotic medium and approaches the type of representation possible in verbal language. To make this idea less abstract, I would like to give what I take as another great example of the pregnant moment. This time not taken from antiquity, taken from a very different model of artwork. I choose this example also in the spirit of autobiography, as it's a painting I grew up seeing at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. This is Rembrandt's painting of Lucretia. Those of you who have taken the Roman sequence with the Graham School will recognize her from the end of the first book of Livy's History of Rome. In Livy's account, Sextus Tarquinius, the son of the tyrannical king of Rome, rapes Lucretia, who consequently stabs herself to preserve her honor. The Roman men are so horrified by the injustice perpetrated on Lucretia that they overthrow the king, thus bringing an end to the age of monarchy and ushering in the Roman Republic. Had Rembrandt depicted the moment when Lucretia plunges the dagger into her breast, we would have a bloody, horrifying picture on our hands. Instead, Rembrandt chooses the moment before this deed, the moment poised between the decision to die and the death itself, a moment of the highest tension between resolve and regret, a moment that we never tire of seeing because in our imagination it seems always to lengthen like a poem. And this is, I think, ultimately what Lessing was after, the growing and deepening of the imagination and our responsivity to the unique representational conditions and possibilities of art. He writes, "It is evident that this single moment and the point from which it is viewed cannot be chosen with too great a regard for its effect, but only that which gives free rein to the imagination is effective. The more we see, the more we must be able to see, and the more we add in our imaginations, the more we must think we see." Goethe's apocryphal last words were, "more light." I would like to imagine that Lessing's last words were, "more imagination." I want to turn now to the field of poetry and poetics, where I feel most at home. Specifically, I want to turn to what is perhaps the most influential theoretical statement on poetry of the age, Friedrich Schiller's 1795 essay on naive and sentimental poetry. In order to understand Schiller's essay, we must disabuse ourselves of the contemporary connotations of the words naive and sentimental. By naive, Schiller does not mean gullible, foolish, simple-minded, and by sentimental, Schiller does not mean sappy, dreamy, nostalgic. But saying what the naive and sentimental are not is easier than defining what they are. Schiller's essay is a labyrinthine, shifting display of thought in motion. We can proceed by considering one of his definitions of the naive. The naive is a childlikeness where we no longer expect it. Let me try to draw out the sense of this definition. The naive is the apparition of uninhibited innocence, a kind of untrammeled naturalness in the midst of the artifice and dissimulation of social life. I think Schiller was one of the first German writers to articulate in a powerful way what for Karl Marx would become the state of the modern laborer under capitalism, namely alienation, the individual's sense of isolation from a cold, hard, externalized reality in which he no longer sees himself, his will reflected. The naive, I would suggest, offers a vision of unalienated existence in the midst of an alienated world. What then is the sentimental? Let me try to provide a definition by considering an example that Schiller gives of the difference between the naive and sentimental in poetry. This will also allow me to explain what this conceptual pairing has to do with poetry in the first place. In his essay, Schiller recalls one of the most celebrated scenes of the Iliad, the encounter in Book 6 between the Trojan Glaucus and the Greek Diomedes. Meeting each other on the battlefield and realizing that their grandfathers were old guest friends, they exchange armor and agree to avoid each other in the further course of the fight. Schiller writes of this scene, hardly would a modern poet, at least hardly one who is such in the moral sense of this word, even have waded as far as here to attest to his joy in this action. We would pardon him all the more easily since our heart also comes to a standstill in the reading of it, and willingly distances itself from the object in order to look into itself. But no trace of all of this in Homer, as if he had been reporting something which occurs every day. Indeed, as if he himself bore no heart in his bosom, he continues in his dry truthfulness. And here Schiller quotes the following lines, which I will cite from Richmond Lattimore's translation of the Iliad, which will always remain close to my heart, being the first translation I read of Homer's epic as a freshman in college. So they spoke, and both, springing down from behind their horses, gripped each other's hands and exchanged the promise of friendship. But Zeus, the son of Cronos, stole away the wits of Glaucus, who exchanged with Diomedes, the son of Tydeus, armor of gold for bronze, for 9 oxen's worth, the worth of 100. Schiller follows this citation with the following comment. Poets of this naive kind are no longer in their proper place in an artificial age. With a few important exceptions, Schiller equates the modern poet with the sentimental poet. The sentimental poet is the poet of reflection, the self-conscious poet who inserts himself into his poetry. Schiller writes further, sentimental poetry is the offspring of abstractedness and silence, and it also invites thereto. The naive is the child of life, and it also leads back to life. In a dialectic typical of the thought of his age, Schiller argues that the overcoming of the sentimental can only be effected by going through it rather than turning away from it, regaining a new naive on the far side of the sentimental. As Schiller makes clear in his critique of Rousseau in this essay, culture is the irreversible precondition of a poetry that can heal the wounds that culture has inflicted on humanity. But what I want to stress here is that by reconceptualizing poets and their poetry in terms of the naive and sentimental, Schiller comes to an understanding of poetry not as the description of an external reality, but as a holistic way of being in the world. The naive and the sentimental are for Schiller ways of being conscious, but they are also ways of feeling. One could speak here of embodied cognition. Poetry, for Schiller, gives us access to these historically marked modes of thinking and feeling. By his own admission, Schiller wrote the essay on naive and sentimental poetry as an attempt to account for the phenomenon that was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Schiller viewed Goethe as a naive poet, born into a sentimental age. In one of his very first letters to Goethe, dated August 23rd, 1794, 4 days before his birthday, Schiller wrote, "Had you been born a Greek or even an Italian, surrounded by the beauties of an exquisite nature and an idealized art, the path you have chosen would have been made infinitely shorter, perhaps even obviated. But here and now, born a German, your Greek mind transplanted into this northern world, you are faced with the choice of becoming a Nordic artist or of creating in your imagination the art which reality withholds from it. With the help of rational thinking, you substituted in your imagination the ancient ideal of art for the poor reality around you." In his response to this letter, Goethe wrote, "I could not have received a more welcome birthday present this week than your letter. With a friendly hand, you draw the sum of my existence." I'm still waiting for a birthday card congratulating me on my Greek mind. Goethe's channeling of Greek culture reaches its height in his great drama, Iphigenia and Tauris, a drama that has in many ways come to be seen as representative of German classicism as a whole. Goethe produced an initial prose version of the play in 1779, but it was during his 2-year Italian journey between 1786 and 1788, a journey that was by far the most productive vacation in the history of German literature, that Goethe refashioned the work into verse. In order to appreciate what Goethe is doing in this play, it is necessary to briefly summarize a few plot points from Goethe's source texts, namely Euripides' 2 dramas Iphigenia and Aulus and Iphigenia and Tauris. The first of these dramas takes place before the Trojan War. It recounts how Agamemnon, the father of Iphigenia and leader of the Greeks, receives an oracle stating that he must sacrifice his daughter before the ships can sail to Troy. He ultimately carries out this act, or is about to carry out this act, when the goddess Artemis intervenes, spiriting Iphigenia away to the foreign land of the Taurisians and leaving behind a deer on the sacrificial altar. Euripides' Iphigenia and Tauris takes place after the Trojan War. Iphigenia is now serving as priestess for the Taurisians, in which capacity she must sacrifice any Greeks that wind up in their lands. Iphigenia's brother, Orestes, and his friend Pylades have in fact wound up in the land of the Taurisians, having been sent by Apollo to retrieve a cult image of Artemis. In a great scene that Aristotle uses in his Poetics to illustrate the concept of anagnorisis, or tragic recognition, Iphigenia and Orestes each realize who the other is and plot their escape. Iphigenia lies to the king of the Taurisians, Thoas, saying she must cleanse the sacrificial victims at the shore, where they sail away. The Taurisians pursue them, but Athena intervenes, and they are saved. Now, the salient difference between Euripides' plot and Goethe's plot is this. Instead of Iphigenia lying to Thoas, the king of the Taurisians, and absconding by means of a deus ex machina, Goethe has his Iphigenia tell Thoas the truth. That is to say, Goethe's Iphigenia tells Thoas, the king of the Taurisians, that the strangers who have washed up on his shores are her brother and his countrymen, that they are plotting escape, and she asks the king of the Taurisians to let them go home freely. Consider a portion of the speech in which Iphigenia admits the plot to Thoas. "Now my heart lifts and sinks as it conceives a daring plan. I shall incur great censure if it fails. This I know well, and grievous suffering. But oh, you gods, I lay it on your knees. If you are truthful, as men say you are, then show it now. Stand by me, that through me truth may be glorified. Here then, my lord, there's a plot intended to deceive you." The significance of this act of truth-telling can hardly be overstated. By telling the truth, Iphigenia has placed her fate and the fate of Orestes and Pylades at the feet of Tauris, the barbarian king. This brings into view Goethe's interpersonal understanding of truth in this drama. Truth in Goethe's Iphigenia and Tauris is more than a matter of stating some fact about the world. To tell the truth is to acknowledge the other's common humanity. To tell the truth is to interpolate the other as an ethical equal. By telling Tauris the truth, she demands of him the highest humanity. For the truth she tells is not just any truth, but a truth for which she is willing to live and die. This is a truth in extremis, truth that reaches the limits of the ethical. In this sense, it anticipates Kierkegaard's idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical in Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. For by informing Tauris of their escape plans, Iphigenia jeopardizes not only her own life, but the lives of Orestes and Pylades as well. In telling the truth, in other words, she puts everything on the line. And it is in such an act, what Iphigenia calls at one point an unheard of deed, in which truth becomes an intersubjective reality, opening up a recognizant space in which Tauris can meet Iphigenia's humanity with his own. Were Iphigenia alone capable of such a deed, recognition would remain one-sided. Tauris would remain excluded from the sphere of civilization, unable to live up to the claim made upon his own humanity. Yet it is not merely a matter of Iphigenia, the civilized Greek, benevolently bestowing upon Tauris, the barbarian, the opportunity to partake in her own privileged existential status. Tauris, in allowing Iphigenia and her kinsman to go free, refuses to treat her as an object, acknowledging her humanity in turn. Like Iphigenia's confession, Tauris's allowance is an act with high existential stakes. For in Goethe's version of the drama, Tauris wishes to marry Iphigenia, a wish born not just out of personal desire, but also out of a concern for the fate of his kingdom, out of the need for a progenitor of his lineage. Thus, neither Iphigenia nor Tauris occupy positions of superiority. Rather, they put everything into each other's hands, relying not on an asymmetrical relation of mastery and servitude, but on their recognition of the other as equal and their being recognized by the other as equal in turn. Civilization in Iphigenia and Tauris, which is often called a civilisationsdrama, a drama of civilization, is not an a priori status inherent to one or the other parties, but rather an achievement of this structure of second-order recognition, recognizing oneself, being recognized by the other. If this all sounds a bit high-minded to you, you are not alone. Heinrich von Kleist, one of the great bad boys of German literature, also called into question the ideas of Goethe's Iphigenia, and in an unprecedentedly radical way. Kleist decided to write a play about another powerful female figure from Greek mythology, Penthesilea, who, in Kleist's version, is, like Iphigenia, a devotee of the virgin goddess of the hunt, Artemis. In Kleist's version, Penthesilea reigns in a radical feminist state from which all men are disbarred. During the Trojan War, the Amazons are enlisted to fight on the side of the Trojans, but Penthesilea, instead of fighting against, falls in love with Greece's greatest warrior, Achilles. Yet this love is doomed. In the climactic scene of the tragedy, Penthesilea, overcome by a trance, sicks her dogs on Achilles and then participates in tearing Achilles apart limb to limb with her teeth, while remarking in her fugue state on the German rhyme, which is in fact not a real rhyme, between biting and kissing, Bisse and Küsse. Against Goethe's highest ideal of human reciprocity and recognition, Kleist has placed the terrifying alliance of Eros and Thanatos, love and death. Achilles' obscene death at the hands or teeth of Penthesilea stands for all that is irrational and uncontrollable in the human being. For reasons of time, I won't give much more of a reading of the play than that. I want simply to convey the unmatched, and in the German language, truly unmatched, linguistic intensity of Kleist's writing. Consider Penthesilea's final speech after she has recovered from her trance and realized the monstrous deed that she has done. For now I shall descend into my breast and dig a shaft and quarry out the cold ore of a feeling that annihilates. This ore I purify in fire of grief to hardest steel. In poison then of bitter, burning remorse, I soak it through and through. Now carry it toward hope's eternal anvil and grind and sharpen it into a dagger. And to this dagger now I yield my breast. So, so, again, now it is done. What you have to keep in mind here is that Penthesilea has no physical dagger in this scene. She fastens a dagger out of metaphor, quarrying the ore from the depth of her being, purifying it with grief, poisoning it with remorse, and sharpening it on the anvil of hope before plunging this word dagger into her breast. It is the unremitting, indeed the almost psychotic intensity of Kleist's language that makes such a scene compelling rather than laughable. Kleist shows us that language really can hurt us, not in the sense of hurting our feelings, but in the sense that language is inseparable from our somatic being. Language is inscribed into and onto our body. For Kleist, poetry truly is a matter of life and death. Goethe, by the way, wrote of Kleist's play, as for Penthesilea, I have not yet been able to warm up to her. I want to turn now to the other great misfit of the age, the other astounding poet who was steeped in classical antiquity, despite his ultimate inability to conform himself to Goethe's and Schiller's aesthetic program, namely Friedrich Hölderlin. Hölderlin is my favorite German poet. It is worth learning German just to read him in the original. But once you learn German, you'll have to forget everything you were taught about its grammar and syntax to read Hölderlin's German. This is because there is no other poet who went so far in pushing the German language to speak Greek. His German is so infused with a Greek idiom and Greek syntactical structures that in some of his works, such as his late translations of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone, done on the brink of madness in 1802, it is nearly impossible to read. The great German Jewish thinker Walter Benjamin wrote in his incomparable essay, The Task of the Translator, of Hölderlin's Sophocles translations, I quote, "In them, the harmony of the languages is so profound that sense is touched by language only the way an Aeolian harp is touched by the wind," end quote. If Hölderlin's language at times only brushes sense, then this is due not only to its Grecicizing syntax and diction, but also due to its meter, the meter of his poetry, which likewise attempts to channel Greek rhythms with a power unmatched by any poet after him. I want to give you an example of this, taken from the opening of Hölderlin's elegy Bread and Wine, written at the turn of the century. I will read the first 4 lines out loud in German, overemphasizing the rhythm so that you can get a sense of what Hölderlin is doing. Ringsum ruhet die Stadt, still wird die erleuchtete Gasse, und mit Fackeln geschmückt rauschen die Wagen hinweg. Satt gehen heim von Freuden des Tages zu ruhen die Menschen. Und mit Gewinn und Verlust weget dein sinniges Haupt. I've indicated the metrical patterning above each line using the traditional symbols of scansion, or the metrical analysis of verse. The dash indicates a strongly stressed syllable, while the U-shaped figure represents a weakly stressed syllable. Hölderlin is imitating here, or rather refashioning for German verse, an ancient metrical scheme that has come to be known as the elegiac distich, and in a simplified version looks like this. If you look closely, you will find some important differences between the metrical scheme and Hölderlin's verse. The issue of how German poets took up Greek and Latin meter is an immensely complex one, and I wrote my dissertation on it, so I'm happy to talk more about it later if anyone has questions. But for right now, I simply want to note that a fundamental dimension of the reception of classical antiquity in German poetry around 1800 is metrical, and more broadly, prosodic. Prosody being understood here broadly as encompassing an array of formal devices such as meter, rhythm, syllable stress, and line breaks. My dissertation argues, if I may give a brief plug here, that prosody, thus conceived, constitutes a current for conveying the poetic past into the present, a form of transmission that resides not merely in the citation or imitation of ancient poets, but rather in the sounds and rhythms that impress themselves on our bodies, imprint themselves on our memories, lodge themselves in our ears. What is at stake in the bounce and the beat of the line, in the pressure and pull of the syllable, is the very life of poetry, its capacity to make its home within us. Few German poets felt and allowed us to feel the heartbeat of the poem like Hölderlin does. Having said that much, let us consider the opening stanza of Bread and Wine in an English translation. All round the city rests, even the lit streets grow quiet, and resplendent with torches, carriages rumble away. Sated men return home, looking from rest from day's pleasure. So many thoughtful heads balancing gain and loss, now home grounded, content. Empty of grapes and flowers, and of its homemade wares, the busy market rests. But a stringed instrument sounds, far away, out of gardens. Maybe a lover is playing there. Some lonely man, perhaps, thinks of his youthful days and of distant friends. And the fountains, springing constantly fresh, rustle the fragrant beds. Calm in the twilight air, bells ring reverberations. And with his mind on the hour, a watchman calls it by name. Now, too, a soft wind rises, riffling the wood's highest branches. Look, and mysterious, the shadow world of our earth, the moon, rises with it, and night, the fanciful dreamer, rises, full of stars, little concerned, so it would seem, about us. There, the amazing, she gleams, stranger to all our people, moving splendid and sad over the mountain peaks. In the 19th century, this stanza circulated alone, and Clemens Brentano, a major romantic poet, called it the most beautiful poem in the German language, even though it is only the first stanza of an 8-stanza poem. Perhaps no other poet but Virgil could paint such an atmospheric portrait of evening. And in reading it, I'm reminded of what the great German art historian Erwin Panofsky remarked about Virgil. With only a slight exaggeration, one might say that he, Virgil, discovered the evening. Panofsky did not, of course, mean anything as silly as that before Virgil, no one realized that there was the evening as a particular time of the day in which the sun was at a particular place in the sky. What he means, I believe, is that poets discover the deep significance of phenomena. Poetry gives us the world, and it gives us the world not as a neutral surface, not as data, not as bare bits of information to be processed and analyzed. It gives us the world saturated in the full significance of what it is like to live in it. In Virgil's hands, the evening is that time of quietude, of reprieve from care that with its broadening shadows descends not just on us, but on the world we inhabit. Yet at the same time, the evening is that time tinged with the melancholy of endings and departures, a premonition of death. In Hölderlin's Bread and Wine, the evening evokes even more than that. It evokes a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. In the course of the poem, Hölderlin reflects on the obsolescence of Greek cultural life, the empty altars, the stillness of their temples. But as you might have guessed from the title of the poem, Bread and Wine, the poem is not only about Ceres and Dionysus, the gods of grain and the gods of wine, but also about Christianity, the body and blood of Christ. In a radically heterodox philosophy of history, Hölderlin here in this poem and elsewhere attempts to think Christianity not as a definitive rupture with Greek paganism, but as its culmination and conclusion. For Hölderlin, this takes the form of a daring synthesis of Dionysus and Christ. Like Christ, Dionysus is intimately associated with wine. Like Christ, Dionysus is born of a human mother and an immortal father. Like Christ, Dionysus dies and rises again in a ritual commemorated annually. Like Christ, Dionysus is a god not indigenous to Europe, but comes from the East. The evening, then, recalls not just the twilight of the pagan gods, but Christ's ascension into heaven, leaving behind the dark night of faith, a night that is not just one of subjective doubt, but a historical nadir between his first and second coming. Both Dionysus and Christ are epiphanic gods, gods whose essence lies in their very coming, their adventus, their advent. Hölderlin's poems is in many ways about what one does in the meantime between the first and second coming of the gods, the time of waiting and hope, the time of absence and suffering. What are poets for when times are hard? Hölderlin asks in one of his most pressing lines of verse. And he continues, yet they are, you say, like the holy priests of the wine god, moving from land to land, on through the holy night. Here, the wine god should be understood as both Dionysus and Christ. The poets for Hölderlin are those who keep the faith. The poets are those who think and thank. The verbs are etymologically related in English as in German. The poets are those who think and thank gods in a time that feels abandoned to its own devices and bereft of the power of the numinous. The poets keep the faith. Hölderlin's elegiac attitude towards ancient Greece is echoed by one of his contemporaries, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was Hölderlin's roommate, along with another great philosopher of German idealism, Friedrich Schelling, at seminary school in Tübingen. One can only imagine the conversations and parties they must have had in their dorm room on a Friday night. Perhaps Hegel's most well-known engagement with the culture of ancient Greece is his treatment of Greek ethical life through a thinly veiled reading of Antigone, in that great work of his youth, the 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit. But I want to focus on another, less frequently cited passage of the Phenomenology. It is also a deeply lyrical passage, and I think the poetry of Hegel's youthful prose goes underappreciated. In the chapter of the Phenomenology entitled Religion, Hegel considers what has become of the artworks of pagan antiquity in the age of monotheism. They are now what they are for us. Beautiful fruit broken off from the tree, a friendly fate passing those works on to us as a gift in the way a young girl might present that fruit. The muses have become museums. Good fortune, a friendly fate, has preserved for us some of these precious fruits, these ancient artworks saved from destruction. Yet, broken off from the tree of life, these fruits are dead. These statues, these temples, these hymns are no longer animated by their life-giving source in the religious practices, the ethical life, the collective self-understanding of a people. With those works of art, fate does not give us their world, does not give us the spring and summer of the ethical life in which they bloomed and ripened. Rather, it gives us solely the veiled remembrance of this actuality. The loss of the artwork's context of creation for Hegel constitutes the loss of a world, the loss of that nexus of meaning that enlivens the products of the human spirit. Our relation to these products, Hegel continues, is no longer one of worship, but of antiquarian cultivation. Our doing is external, which wipes off some drop of rain or speck of dust from these fruits. We preserve them, study them, characterize, and catalog them. They exist for us not as a reality that we can inhabit, but as a memory of a formerly inhabited reality, the veiled remembrance of this actuality. Melusina, the mother of the muses, now stands in for the absence of her children. The beauty embodied in the artworks of ancient Greeks, in Hegel's view, has become historical, not a living ideal, but an object of memory. Hegel's reflections on the pastness of beauty received its most elaborate treatment in the lectures on aesthetics delivered multiple times between 1818 and 1829. Hegel is often misunderstood as advocating the claim in these lectures that after the high point of Greek cultural production in the 5th century BC, art was over. But he was certainly not arguing anything as demonstrably absurd as that after this period, no one made anything that we would classify as art. Rather, he maintains that art, considered in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. For Hegel, art's highest purpose is to make sensuously manifest the freedom of the human spirit. Art imprints the subjectivity of self-consciousness on the world. The human being stamps upon an external reality the seal of his inmost being, and thereby renders this reality no longer purely external, a foreign object, a natural necessity over and against a subjective inside. In this reconciliation between inner and outer, subject and object, self-conscious life grasps itself in a non-alienated form. Spirit, the collective self-understanding of a particular people at a particular point in history, does not remain pent up in itself, inchoate and inarticulate, but rather shines forth in the formed material of the artwork. It is this sensuous manifestation of spirit in finite form, artistic beauty or the ideal, Hegel calls it, and that he links in particular with Greek statuary. It is this sensuous manifestation that he maintains as a thing of the past. In the lectures on aesthetics, the classical age gives way to the age of romantic art, an age that, as Hegel conceives it, is coextensive with the Christian era. In romantic art, the ideal has retreated from the radiant shining forth of the divine exemplified in Greek statuary into an invisible interiority. When we consider a painting of the crucifixion, we see but a corpse, yet this unbeautiful mortal body concentrates within itself something higher than beauty, eternal life, life that has gone through death and grasped it as the negation of the negation, as a dying away of the finite self that reveals spirit's deeper freedom from this finitude. Yet what I want to stress at the end of this talk is that what Hegel describes in the phenomenology of spirit, in the lectures on aesthetics, is something like the birth of historical consciousness, a consciousness aware of its own historicity, its own formation in and by a particular place and time. This sense of historicity is so fundamental to the development of the modern university and the very idea of scholarship up to the present day that it seems simply intuitive and obvious to us. That artworks do not embody timeless norms, but rather reflect the values of a particular historical moment. That we do not have unmediated access to objects of the past, but rather encounter them within new frames and contexts. That we must not judge artworks by our own contemporary standards, but must rather seek to reconstruct and understand the historical standards under which they were created and received. These are all basic premises of historical scholarship. Yet this historical consciousness developed over time, and the shaping of it is one of the many contributions of German thought during the late 18th and early 19th century. And it is a way of thinking that you encounter every time you walk into a museum that orders its artworks chronologically, a principle of ordering that was pioneered by the curation of the Altes Museum in Berlin, which brings me back full circle to where I started this promenade of thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. We have a number of questions. Where am I? There I am. We have a number of questions. Let me get right to them. First of all, let me type the last one received. Okay, the first one comes from Jim Rice, and Jim asks, what would Lessing say about Edvard Munch's The Scream painting?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jim, and it's good to see you again from class last quarter. I think that Lessing would be horrified with it. I think Lessing is really advocating a sort of strict and in some sense conservative neoclassical ideal of art in which such a sort of grotesque shocking, arresting scream would not be in the order of the day. Lessing says that for the Greeks, beauty is the highest ideal of art, which may seem intuitive in a certain way. I mean, yeah, art is about beauty, but I think when you think of a painting like The Scream, or when you think of much modern art, it actually seems to be the case that beauty, in the sense of a sort of aesthetically pleasing object, is actually not the prerogative. That there are other values and other demands, even the demand of truth, a truthfulness that would be true to the horror of suffering and not not aestheticize that, comes to the fore. And yeah, I think that that's not within Lessing's aesthetic vision. I think that that's not with.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jim, for your question. The next question comes from L.R. Cross, who asks, question, have you discovered any influence on the African slave trade and searching for the Greek soul? I'm curious about the contact with slavery's brutality, parenthesis, the barbarian, and the civilized, parenthesis, the Greek. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't. It doesn't come to mind for me. I mean, in the period that Goethe is writing, and I think Goethe's play would be sort of most relevant to this. Germany is not an imperial power at this point. They're not a colonial power. There's not even a German, nation state at this point. So I think sort of engagement with the slave trade and colonial projects is sort of less on the horizon, less on the radar of Goethe and his German contemporaries than it is for the English Romantics, say. In many ways, I think Goethe is more oriented towards the kind of injustices that are perpetuated in the small, petty, kind of tyrannical principalities that make up Germany at the time. in many ways, I think that is his social context. But I'll just say this one last thing now that it occurs to me. In 1967, or maybe it was even 1968, during the student protests in Germany and throughout Europe, the great Marxist philosopher Theodor Adorno gave a lecture on Goethe's Iphigenia in Tauris. And the students found this to be a totally conservative move. You know, everything's on fire. The sort of the past is being questioned. The complacency of, you know, the generation of the parents who lived through and collaborated in World War II and Nazism is being questioned. And Adorno just comes and gives a talk on a classical play by Goethe. But if you read that essay, Goethe, Adorno reads Iphigenia in Goethe's classicism as sort of radically calling into question these hierarchies of the civilized and the barbaric. So it really becomes a kind of political, an almost leftist political message at a time of deep social unrest. So it has a really interesting afterlife.
Thanks for that, Simon. That was interesting. Thank you for your question, LR. The next question comes from Charles Fout, who asks, are you able to address how the classics may have impacted the German social sciences of the 19th century?
The German social sciences of the 19th century.
Maybe including history.
Yeah, that's that's not so fresh in my head. That's not so much my orientation. I mean, as Kendall mentioned, I mean, of course, the German historiography is really coming into its own here in a really kind of rigorous sort of empirically based, archivally based, data-based, as it were, orientation is coming into its own. I could say this isn't quite the social science, but in the field of philology, which traditionally means the sort of study, commentary, collation, construction of editions of text, the presentations of text, Germany really pioneers this work. And German scholars pioneer this work with a sort of renewed and deepened knowledge of the Greek language in particular. And that kind of philological tradition is foundational to modern scholarship. I mean, across the board, like I know even, I TA'd a class for German for reading purposes, and everybody in the divinity school had to take that class because German scholarship, its work on Eastern religions, the Romantics' discovery of India and Indian philosophy, was so influential and so foundational in their scholarly contributions, so important that it's still with us today. The department still thinks you need to read some German to be able to access that.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Charles, for your question. The next question comes from Jeffrey Sarles, who asks, do your Germans each embody, perhaps dialectically, elements of both classicism and romanticism?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a hard question. You're right to think. I mean, romanticism was in many ways the other great movement of the age, and of course, I mean, this is a bit stereotyped at this point, but of course, traditionally it's thought that the Romantics turned towards the Middle Ages rather than classical antiquity, and they turned towards what they saw as a more indigenous culture, folk tales, the German troubadour types, But many of the great romantics started out as classical scholars, and they brought that with them. And I think that there's a certain point in the progression of this thought where classical just comes to mean, I mean, in a sense, what it means to us today. I mean, a kind of enduring canonical work of literature of great sort of ethical and philosophical import. And so there's a way in which they intersect in that. I think another great example of that intersection is the third act of part 2 of Goethe's Faust, which I'll be teaching in the Graham School in the fall. So that's a little plug. But in that act, Goethe has Faust summon Helen of Troy into the Middle Ages, and they fall in love. And that's essentially a union between the classical and the medieval, between the Greek and the German. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. And Jan just put the link. If you want to register for Simon's fall course on Goethe, the link is now the most recent contribution to the chat. Thank you, Jeffrey, for your question, and Simon for your answer. The next question comes from Anne Krause, who asks, did the Greek language influence the German language in this period, roughly 1780 to 1800? Did any words enter the lexicon?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly sort of syntactically, morphologically, I would say no. German was sort of already long in development and, has a different origin than the Greek language. But there's certainly the idiosyncrasies that I talked about with Hölderlin. But those are sort of unique to the idioms of individual poets. Yeah, if particular words entered the lexicon, I'm trying to think. I mean, certainly that must have happened. Certainly they must have used words like polis or kalos um, uh, um, or things like this. Um, but it was really a way of. But I would say, the German language at the time was not as standardized as it was today. In the age I'm talking about, punctuation, capitalization, these sorts of things were still very much um, in the air, and we're still very much sort of up in the air. Um, and this rigorous engagement with Greek in a kind of sort of scientific almost engagement with Greek rather than a kind of casual antiquarianism could also have had influences on the sort of standardization of German as a literary philosophical language. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Anne, for your question. The next question comes from Karin Kunze, who asks, fascinating discussion of the prosaic works of these Germans. Why were there so many poets and philosophers in the 18th and 19th century in Germany?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's good to see you or hear your question, Karin. um, uh, Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, this is a sort of very old-fashioned stereotype now that Germany is the land of poets and thinkers, das Land der Dichter und Denker. And frankly, that's what drew me to the study of the language. Like it's just it's so rich. Why it seems that so many cropped up at the time, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it may have something to do with what I mentioned at the very beginning, that Germany, not until 1871 was Germany was not a nation state. It didn't have a unified political system and a unified um, political, ethnic, national consciousness. So I think that the Germans turned to the cultural realm as a way to articulate a particular national consciousness. Culture and poetry becomes the vehicle for a sense of of the people as a whole. Yeah, rather than politics, or rather than a unified state with an army that conquers other armies and so forth. So I think that might play a role.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Karin, for your question. The next question comes from Christine Bartels, who asks, this is more of a question, or more of a comment than a question. There would have been an interesting conversation to be had between Hegel and Nietzsche, the latter in his role as author of Wir Philologen. This is all very thought-provoking. Thanks. I don't know if you want to rejoin. We have 3 more questions.
Yeah, well, Hegel or Nietzsche sort of historically hated Hegel as for what he took as Nietzsche being or Hegel being a kind of systematizing philosopher who had claimed to sort of, had a complete metaphysical system, a kind of grasping of the nature of reality. But I think at the end of my talk, when I talked about how for Hegel in the lectures on aesthetics, in Christian art, in some sense, spirit, sort of human expressivity retreats inward. You just see Christ suffering on the cross, and it's just a body in pain. But there's a deep inner spiritual significance to that. I think that that's actually not so far from Nietzsche's argument in the genealogy of morals, which I'm teaching now in the basic program, where he says that Christianity, he says religiosity in general, but Christianity in particular, by turning our aggressive impulses inwards, opens up a vast realm of interiority. And sort of creates a sort of infinite depth to the human psyche. And so I think that's a certain parallel or a certain overlap there between Hegel and Nietzsche. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Christine, for your comment. I'm going to combine 2 of the 3 remaining questions because they overlap. Thomas Miller asks, were German scholars of the early 1800s able to understand their history without seeing it in the shadow or lens of the Greeks? And along similar lines, Sonia Kotlicha asks, did these poets choose on their own the Greek culture, or was there a political influence at the time when German states were being unified under Prussia and Berlin? At the time, German states were being unified under Prussia, and Berlin was compared to Athens.
Yeah, those are great questions. Did Germany, how did how did they make this connection? How did they make this connection? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking, I think in many ways it had already been there. This classical tradition, I mean, of course it never really dies. It goes on and throughout the Middle Ages and has precedence, probably most relevantly for Germany, in France. So I think it's there, but it becomes revitalized. And that's why I start with Winckelmann, because I think he gives this a new impetus. And then it really just sets off. Whether that has to do with, Prussian influence and Prussian militarism and their sort of growing cultural hegemony in the region, I don't know. That could be possible. I mean, Friedrich the Great is famously learned and corresponding with the Enlightenment figures, so that sort of makes there being an opening there. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Thomas and Sonia. And the final question comes from Jennifer Lind, who asks a concluding question. Are there 2 or 3 books or articles you would recommend for further reading for those of us new to this topic? Thanks for an amazing and insightful presentation.
Yeah. I would recommend Kleist's play Penthesilea, in the translation by Joel Agee, Agee. It's a beautiful translation, and the introduction gives a good sort of example, a good sort of treatment of this topic. Otherwise it's a bit difficult. A lot of this stuff is still in German. Hopefully I can publish a book on it one day, and then you can read that. Yeah, but I think starting with Kleist's play is a very compelling way in. That's what comes to mind right now. Yeah.
Well, thanks for your answer, Simon, and thanks for your question, Jennifer. And now we've come to the end of our event, and we have a custom where I'm going to ask you all to unmute so that Simon can hear the applause.
Danke.
What are you doing?
That was great.
Fabulous.
Wonderful.
Danke.
That was
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to see
Thank
you.
you. Great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Simon.
Danke.
I think it's already on the interview.
Danke.
Okay.
Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön.
Ja,
Guten Tag.
bitte.
Thank you, Danke to everyone for coming to our event. And now I will